Hello, David.
Hi
How
there.
are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yourself?
I'm very well indeed, thank you. Very well indeed. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time because I know how busy you are and how busy you've been over the last 18 months. I guess today we're going to be talking about pathology in the NHS, how digital pathology has changed the way that pathology runs, the successes, the challenges of those 29 networks in the NHS. We'll also be discussing how those networks have handled the COVID pandemic. We'll touch, I think, a lot on your career, if that's okay, and talk about your highlights, maybe. And of course, your new role within the Institute of Biomedical Science. So to kick off, today being the birthday of the NHS, 73 today. David, you've worked in biomedical science now for over 20 years. You've worked for Great Ormond Street. You've been a lecturer. You've worked for Viapath for 4 years. You've headed up pathology for the NHS Improvement. Looking back on your career, what are some of the highlights for yourself?
Good question. Actually, I think there've been so many. I think the real highlights for me personally has really been in the last 18 months leading the pathology response to COVID in England. I think that has clearly, as a scientist, as somebody working in pathology, having the opportunity or the privilege actually to be so keenly involved in that response has been a real humbling moment in my career, and certainly something which I will never forget for as long as I live, and I'm sure many other people won't as well. So I think that necessarily would have to be a real highlight for my career. But I think it's a testament to all the stuff that has happened in the past, if that makes sense. So my career, right from starting as a medical laboratory assistant in Cambridge, training there and qualifying there, and then moving on and working in a multi-site London suburbs hospital. Then, as you mentioned, Great Ormond Street, and also Viapath at Guy's, Thomas's and King's. They all led me to build my skill set, if you like, to be in that situation where I was able to contribute so much, I think. So it's really hard to pick out one item. I suppose I've always been very proudly a biomedical scientist, and the values and the things that we can bring. And so, I think it's that would have to be the proudest moment of my career. But onwards and upwards, clearly. I mean, I'm now starting. It's 4 weeks in since I started at the Institute of Biomedical Science, and I hope I've got much more to contribute to the profession and the wider dialogue around pathology, and not just in England, but in the rest of the UK and globally, because of course we do cover right across the globe. So there's still much to do, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. In your experience then, when you look back on your career, has biomedical science and pathology become a dying art over the last few years, and is technology disrupting that profession now?
So I think it's not a dying art. I think that there was a while ago, just after the Topple review, somebody did say that who'd want to work in pathology? It's a dying art. Absolutely. I mean, could not be further from the truth. The expansion of technologies that drive up and increase our ability to diagnose patients in different ways. The new tools available to us every day have all added to what is actually a massive expanding profession. I think the profession is going to change, and I think quite rightfully our clinical colleagues need to spend more time on the areas where they add most value in the patient pathway. And as we build our understanding of how that works, then more senior scientists, more what I would call perhaps advanced practice consultant grade scientists will come to the fore, making it an incredibly more interesting role. So certainly when I started as a medical laboratory assistant, I sort of naively hoped I might make senior scientist, and if I end up as a chief within a lab, I'd be very lucky. But I now know that many of my colleagues starting out today should be aspiring to advanced practice roles, heading up organisations, very, very senior management, but also very, very senior clinical roles, heading up departments. And when I started, it was unusual to see a scientific head of an organisation. Absolutely, our scientists bring such value, and pathology is of such critical importance to the healthcare system that actually they should be involved in every aspect of that. And we're seeing more and more of that, and I think the pandemic has exposed that. So I would always say, and I mean this vehemently, that there is so much more you can work in pathology. I have never regretted a single moment of what I've done, both clinically and professionally and managerially, all those things. I would not have done in any other profession, full stop. And so I suspect others will come, I hope others will come forward and see that. We have also spent a lot of time breaking down some of the glass ceilings. So access to qualifications are now open to everyone who has got the skills and capabilities. So our biomedical scientists have access to the highest scientific specialist training alongside our clinical science colleagues. We have colleagues undertaking advanced practice diplomas so that they can report alongside their clinical colleagues and their medical colleagues. We've got people working in digital environments, adding new skills and ways of working, ways of reporting, developing new technologies. So it is only going to expand. It is going to be different, but it is only going to expand. And I like to think more interesting with every sort of generation of science to come forward.
Well, that's good to hear, and certainly it feels a little bit like for many years pathology has been from what people tell me, it's been an undervalued part of any hospital, but incredibly important and pivotal. Do you think that because what we've experienced with COVID, that's kind of brought pathology into the limelight a bit more and maybe made people realize how important good pathology departments are?
I'm hoping so. So I agree with you. I think pathology is always seen, I suppose the analogy I would say is that pathology has always been seen as a black box that clinicians and managers can do very, very little with. And I think that's fundamentally not true, because we're so involved and so central to the patient pathway that if you don't involve what's happening within our pathology technology, you are always going to struggle. Now, I think now that we've been through the pandemic, but also work we were doing in advance of that was to try and start to build into the system and understanding that actually you could add value, pathology can add value in understanding your patient pathways. So although you may not be able to change how long it takes to undertake a test, you could change the time in which you do that test, or you could change who you give that test to. And we're seeing that, again, part of the recovery from the pandemic, accessing imaging technology, so things like endoscopy. We're now using routinely fit testing in more people to triage individuals. Now, we've always known that is probably a possibility, but really the needs must now has brought that to the fore. People realizing actually, if I test differently, if I do things differently, I can actually add to the value of my patient pathway and how I'm using my testing capabilities. And I think the people who have heard me talk a lot about a move towards early diagnostics, the ability to pick up patients or individuals before they become patients is to become really important. And then delivering the right test at the right time becomes more and more important. And we already know if you're doing tests for people with heart attacks, with strokes, it makes a critical difference to their outcomes. But those are very acute, those are very visible there and then.
Yeah.
More often now, I suspect we're going to start realizing that managing long-term conditions also requires that expediency of the right tests at the right time to ensure you get the right outcomes. And that could just be around education and learning, it could be deploying approach, it could well be starting people's treatment plans, etc. But all those things add value. And I think the true and genuine value is something which I'm hoping that as a country we explore more of. The value of testing for the population is going to change, and whatever happens post-pandemic, whether we see ourselves doing regular flu testing, whether we see ongoing COVID testing, which I'm sure we will do for a while yet, but we're starting to see the value that adds to the health of the nation, the wealth of the nation, and how well we can work. And avoiding people becoming unwell with flu, particularly those at high risk groups, is a very valuable thing for us to do. We've learned it and seen it at great scale with COVID, so it could well be of value. But it does, we have to step carefully within that minefield, because there will be some tests that don't have value. So we've got to work out which tests they are, which ones do add value into the system.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, I think we do obviously now live in a very, very different world. I think I certainly have taken flu jabs, um, almost ignored them really as an individual. I've never taken a flu jab, and you sort of take that for granted. Obviously now with COVID, I've just had my second jab last week, so you know in a week or two I'll be fully vaccinated, obviously. But it certainly makes you change your opinion and your mindset. Is that kind of the goal really for, you know, the NHS to kind of maybe put more importance on just the flu jab, which was kind of taken for granted a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd perhaps almost move away from using the NHS as the policy, because actually some of this needs to be way in advance of us using the NHS. It may well be the NHS to deliver some of these preventative services, but actually, you know, that the idea around regular flu vaccinations. I mean, as a person working within healthcare, I've had my flu vaccinations regularly, and you're right. Personally, what value did it add to me? Well, probably very little. If I became unwell with flu, I'd be unwell with flu, but I'd be fine. But actually, we've never really measured the impact upon the wider community just by avoiding people becoming unwell with flu, particularly those people who are at risk. And I think increasingly we will see people taking that as an example, but others as well, that start saying to the nation's health, if like, that actually it is important. And just to digress slightly, if we go to countries such as Japan, who have probably one of the lowest cost per GDP for healthcare, but also one of the best outcomes in terms of lifetime years lived, it's quite stark. Now, some of that is probably genetic, some of that is probably diet, but a large proportion, I suspect, is the fact that actually your personal health is your responsibility. Your personal health is also your employer's responsibility, and your personal health is also your healthcare providers and the national healthcare provider system responsibility. So everyone takes a shared interest in your health, and that's a big, big difference. And you know, if that means we avoid obesity, if that means we keep people active, if that means people are being investigated earlier for long-term conditions or life-limiting conditions such as cancer, then that again could be a real game changer, couldn't it? And I think you know, the flu is just a small example of actually we could do very differently more broadly.
Yeah, and I think that's where, you know, again, the people I speak to who work in the NHS from either a clinical or a digital transformation point of view. So I'm talking about CIOs, CCIOs who have a real vested interest in improving patient outcomes, and now looking at how technology and digital can drive that data, artificial intelligence. That's really been accelerated because of COVID, I think. Would you agree? Have we reached that tipping point now?
Well, so I'm going to be careful and say yes, it's been accelerated. The ability to transfer COVID data around the country is phenomenal. The ability for someone to take a single barcode and link that back to an individual, but also go through an entire testing regime is amazing. And that gets back into, so for example, if you have a COVID test undertaken by the .gov website approach, i.e. go to a community testing centre, that information is back up in your GP, your primary health care records, and it happens on the basis of a single barcode from your interaction on the website at the very start of that process. Now that's phenomenal. That connectivity is phenomenal and really helps in our response. Now, what I would say is, yes, we've made massive strides, and equally within the hospital structures, so within the NHS and PHE, a similar structure now is available, that every single laboratory is connected for their COVID testing, to be able to report back centrally, to be able to take along with it all the data that's needed to inform public health and undertake all the test and trace requirements, etc. So that is phenomenal, but it is just for COVID. And we need to expand that capability to every other condition, so that, and I know this is the vision of people like Simon Eccles from NHSX, and I completely support that view, that whatever your healthcare or wherever your healthcare record is held, anybody who needs to access your healthcare records for delivery of your healthcare or delivery of public health should be able to access it wherever they are.
Yeah.
That means if you have a heart attack in Edinburgh and then go on, be discharged and go home, and then you have a subsequent heart attack in Cornwall, the clinicians treating you in Cornwall should be able to access the information that was seen in Edinburgh and all the care in between, for example, because that will materially change the way they'll manage you. They'll materially change the way they will approach the next steps. And I think that is stark, and it is possible. We've shown it's possible with COVID. And again, the complexity around COVID is quite light. We're talking about a positive, negative, or equivocal. We're talking about some basic demographic data. That's it. And when we're talking about cancer, or we're talking about more complex care, we might be sending genomic data. We may well be sending risk scores. The richness of that is probably unending. But we need to make sure we learn that too. And I think that's where caution needs to be. The success of COVID, we need to make sure that what we do push out there is the right thing for everything, not just COVID.
No, absolutely. I totally agree, and I think lots of people will definitely agree with you there, David. So when you talk about data, obviously at the moment, every NHS trust I speak to is doing something around EPR, electronic patient records, or EHR. So you touched on that there, talking about patient data. How are pathology systems then interfacing with EPRs, like, Epic, as an example, across acute trusts, and should trusts, integrate their LIMS with EPRs to interface to a separate LIMS? And I'm talking very technically there, so people that don't understand that, maybe LIMS, laboratory information management systems, EPRs, electronic patient records. There's obviously a lot of suppliers and vendors out there. There's a core. How much of a challenge is that, bringing all of those different vendors together and getting them to talk to each other?
So I think it's really complex, isn't it? And I think the biggest issue, I suppose, is our legacy system. So we've got systems that can't communicate in a way that we want to. And these legacy systems may well be in the laboratory, or they may well be in the electronic patient records, or they could be anywhere in between. They could be in the bridging between the two of those. So I think the first thing I would always say is that we as a country need to make sure that we're investing heavily on bringing everyone up to a common standard. Those will be a common starting point, will be the most important. But that still could take years. I mean, a single LIMS deployment can take 12 months, 18 months, 3 years, depending on the complexity of it. And we need to not rush those. That's going to be really important. And so I suppose the key thing for me is build the interoperability. So the connections between EPR and LIMS, make sure it's seamless, make sure it works, make sure you're connecting across as many of your users and suppliers, etc., as is possible. Now, you'll know that have been leading up until a month ago the National Transformational Program around pathology, and that was all around delivering pathology networks. The ability for one laboratory to serve up to 10 different trusts is going to be really important. It's going to be vital. So again, that standardization of messaging, the ability to interoperate. Now, whether that's delivering a sort of umbrella integration layer, or whether it's actually going and replacing LIMS or running off one single LIMS, I suppose it's all down to the local system about what is affordable or appropriate or fit for purpose or clinically appropriate. But that should not, none of those things should preclude the ability to take a piece of data on a patient and get it back into their record. And I'd also just overlay it with and this should also include the ability to connect into national databases. Now, I won't specify, or not a database, but connecting to national systems to enable us to take data, inferences, information, and to make sure that we're to benchmark and support and then also going back to my initial point around a clinician in Cornwall, which is about the data derived from a clinician in Edinburgh.
Yes, it's a massive challenge, isn't it? And if trusts can pull it off, the benefits are huge, obviously. And does that push into, when we were talking about the future workforce? So talking about a little bit more about what you you mentioned earlier. What does that future workforce look like, and from a clinical and that technical point of view?
I think so. It's going to be quite a diverse workforce, I think, and it's going to be a workforce that works in a very different way. Perhaps going back to what we were saying on about, is pathology a dying, arts place to work? The answer is absolutely no. There are probably three types of staff of the future, if you like, that will need to have technical and digital skills that they don't have now. The first one will be our clinical colleagues, those who will be reporting using new media reporting. So this is the shift from glass slides to digital images in histopathology, and also managing very large genomic and proteomic data sets to drive out clinical decisions. And that's a very different way of working. If you speak to any clinician, they'll talk about the transition between glass slides and digital imaging. It is a different way of working, and it brings with it its pros and its cons. And understanding those is really important when it comes to reporting. Being able to manage that clinically safely is an expectation our patients will have on us. And so again, our workers will need to make sure they've got that capability. The next set of workforce within this new digital world is those who are designing those systems, designing the algorithms, designing the machine learning, designing the AI. What does it mean when you've got a decision support tool that's entirely software mediated? How do you make sure you build in the checks and the balances that you would have if this was a clinical, standard clinical pathway? When software designers, do they have the appropriate clinical qualifications and experience to make sure that they thought through all the permutations, so that we don't drive into an algorithm a bias or a clinical failure point, if you like? And so that's the second type of workforce. That's one who are very computer literate, very much driven around the software design, but have got the clinical skills to make sure the designs they have are safe. Yeah. I think perhaps I'll also add to that, there's also those people who go through and interpret and interrogate those systems to make sure once they're written and deployed, that they're really doing it as they say. And that's another, perhaps another component of workforce. And then the third one is just actually the likes of you and I, if you like. Every single person working within healthcare in the future will need to be able to be digitally competent, understand when you transfer data, what does it mean, think about the complexities around moving data around, what does it mean, how it's interpreted, what else do I need to send with that data to make sure that data is right. And again, that's a new way of working, a new way of thinking. When you send out the paper report, it normally contained all the information the clinician was expecting to see. When we're talking about sending data, have we considered everything that's on that report, the written report, and is it going, or are we making assumptions?
Yeah.
I suppose the obvious one is, putting on reference ranges, for example. Did we include the reference ranges? Do we tell them the reference ranges are different from their previous or more regular provider, etc.? There's a whole range of stuff that would be naturally communicated in a traditional sense, but we need to make sure naturally communicated in a digital sense. And again, that takes a different mindset. So that's the other skills that the people, that individual have to develop.
That's interesting. So it feels like pathology is maybe catching up with many other industries where there's a greater reliance on digital, skills. Whether it be, now we're teaching our kids how to code with HTML. It feels kind of similar in a way that probably, I guess, being a biomedical scientist, you wouldn't think that you needed to have IT skills, but that's going to be in the future very, very important. Talking about the networks, I know that there's 29 networks around the UK. Some are, really advanced in where they are in terms of introducing that hub and spoke, bringing in one single LIMS. There are others that are a little bit behind. Have you noticed that certain regions have done better or faced bigger challenges because, during COVID? Is that? Yeah,
so I think this is a personal reflection, not a reflection on my previous employer, if you like. So I'll add that caveat. So, but and knowing what I do know is, yes, the more advanced networks, the networks who are able to work as a single entity, have definitely performed better during COVID. They've been both better at adopting technology, about building capacity, about running services that run 24/7, have been able to support other areas of the country as well. So yeah, their resilience and their capability was marked. And I think that, and one of the key facts in that is if they were a developed, maturing network with single entity. Now, then if we expand that more regionally, yes, some regions did better. And again, some regions within the NHS worked best because they either deployed focused teams around pathology that supported that. But again, I think the background of that is regions who have more mature networks did much better.
Right.
So again, it goes back to that backstop of actually there is a critical size and mass of pathology delivery that enables better capability, broader capability, greater continuity and capacity to take on change. And I don't think that's going to change in any way, shape, or form. And we know this from even when we talk about much smaller single sites, that it's always been the case that your large university teaching hospital, on the whole, did better than your very small DGH.
Yeah.
And all we've done is we've expanded that position to say, actually, you know what, when multiple trusts work together in a single way, under a single strategic direction and not organizational form, they do better. And we haven't yet tested, or we haven't yet seen as a country what that critical size is. It probably is bigger than what we're currently talking about.
Okay. And going back to the technical logistics of putting these networks in place, and touching on cloud-based LIMS, the vendors themselves, there are vendors that have been around for a long time in the NHS. They are well established, in some ways an easy choice for a network to go with. But how do challenging vendors who have not worked in the NHS but potentially have, how can they disrupt that, or how can they challenge those more traditional vendors and to deliver something better potentially for the NHS? How does that competition work?
It's very difficult. It's a very, very difficult one, isn't it? And I think we also we saw during the pandemic that reliance upon single suppliers around business continuity is not good. I mean, we saw with the constrained reagent supply, the availability of equipment when the world rushed for technology, left us in a situation where we needed to rely upon a broad base of suppliers. And certainly, I think of the success in the NHS has been its reliance on a very large number of suppliers. We also saw during 2020, when we had one of the major suppliers had an inability to ship some of their reagents. That also exemplified the fact that actually reliance on a single supplier is a risk, not insurmountable. So let's not be say anything other than that. But it's still a risk, and I think the same goes for IT. Putting all of your capability in the hands of one or two or three suppliers as a country is probably not the best thing to do at all. And actually, we need to make sure that there's probably three things we need to do. One is we need to make sure legislation allows for innovation and allows for or supports innovation of new technologies. And I think the government currently are making sounds that that's what they want to do. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is organizations, networks, whatever, need to make sure when they're procuring that they're looking at how they get the ability to access new entrants to the market. So if they're going for a main supplier, which they probably are, because that's the one who can do the most global work, but making sure they're building into their contracts that says, well, if I find someone who can do this better than you, then I want to be able to use that supplier, or building in some get-out clauses that allow a new and better technology to drive that. And then the third item is one around the industry, I suppose, is well, actually, industry needs to support itself. It's not in anyone's interest, although it may feel like it, to be the only supplier in the country. Yes, although you might get a large market share, but it actually doesn't drive forward innovation, does not support the companies, even when they're working globally around how they'll invest in a particular country. So, the ability to bring forward support, work together, collaborate around a range of suppliers is also going to be important. So, again, I would call upon industry as a whole to make sure that this is working collaboratively wherever it can with new entrants, to support them on the basis that actually the global, or the final finished product is going to be far more scalable for both parties if they're able to do that. And build systems built around single suppliers, contracts that say you only work with me or my named collaborator. Those should be actively discouraged, and it should be all around capability, efficiency, yes, cost, because again that's important, but also patient safety and outcomes as well. So if you've got a brand new entrant in the market that requires data to be transferred to it so that it can take a clinical function, for example, it's got to be right for that. It's got to be affordable for that company to make that work. It's got to be affordable to customers, and because the end side of that, of course, is the patient's benefit. And we shouldn't, we wouldn't want to, we shouldn't see contracts preventing that sort of thing to happen.
And when we talk about funding, that's something that I hear a lot when applying for funding from the Department of Health to implement a new LIMS and remove an end-of-life product. And that can be a really big challenge for those CIOs and CEOs of those trusts. Is there a plan to make that an easier process? And is there, do you feel that there is more funding for diagnostics now? Is there a bigger demand, or I guess more of an appetite for the government and the NHS to go, okay, we're now going to invest more in pathology. It's been undervalued for so long. We now recognise that we need to spend more money to actually improve patient outcomes in the future.
So I think the government's heard that, if I'm honest. And again, I'm going to be really careful how I say this, but I know that the government is looking to invest record amounts of money in diagnostics from the most recent spending reviews, together with some very positive noises long term. The sort of money we're talking about is the sort of money that we've been talking about in our program right from day one, around how if we wanted to bring forward the ability for organisations to network, they needed a sizable and significant investment to do that. Now, my understanding is, and clearly these things do all change, and they will change, I'm sure, that the government is minded to support that, and there has been some agreement around some of that. I think I really welcome that, and I think there still could be more, and I think there still should be more. Those are huge enablers. I think there's also some really positive noises coming out around workforce, around delivering more of our workforce, around paying for more scientists to come through the various routes, both at the more junior level and more senior level. Now, that as a net effect shows that actually the Department of Health, the government, the NHS are really clear that diagnostics is an important space to be working in, and it has a game-changing effect. It will stop people taking up beds. It will stop or avoid people attending outpatient clinics, or can attend more sensible outpatient clinics. It can make sure the right drugs are being used at the right time. It can make sure patients are going right through to the first consult that is a relevant first consult, as opposed to a triaging step. All of those things add massive value to the NHS, not only in patient outcome, but if a hospital bed costs, I don't know, £300 a day, and you can avoid a person being there for a week just by the right test, and a test costs you £30, then why on earth aren't you doing it? And so I think that view of the government and Department of Health knows that they should invest at the front now is really very, very welcome, and I think important. And I'd like to think as well, testament to the work that's gone on over the last 4 years to really bring to bear that profile of the networking program, the value it may will add, and then really exemplified by what happened during COVID, where very genuinely, we were able to move patients around hospitals on the basis of their COVID results, and hospitals were able to stand up elective care and on the basis of COVID results, able to access capacity that they were not able to access on the basis of the COVID results. So that really showed that diagnostics was enabler of process flow.
The other challenge, of course, for me personally as a recruiter in this space, especially obviously on the technical side, is that when a trust is looking to disband or take out an end of life product and bring in a new LIMS, they need people. And they need people that have got that unique understanding and balance of, technical IT capability with an understanding of the workflows that a pathologist or a biomedical scientist has to go through. So they have to understand all those different pathology disciplines. But the challenge we've got right now, and I've been tracking this for some time, is a lot of the project managers, the business analysts, the technical architects, the testers, they've all gone into track and trace. They're working for all the super labs at the moment, and they're doing brilliant work, don't get me wrong, but that's now left a bit of a hole in the NHS. So, and as an example, I know that SynLab, who are taking over Viapath and running South East London pathology, they're having to basically come up with some really innovative recruitment strategies to try and get the people in for themselves to actually stand up what they have committed to. And if they can't find these people permanently, they're going to have to recruit contractors, so that the cost is going to go up. But they're taking people out the NHS. So I know that Great Ormond Street, as an example, have actually had some of their team, because they've got that Epic experience, that have now gone over to SynLab. So that's a challenge as well. It's almost robbing Peter to pay Paul. What are we going to do to try and change that? What's the compromise there, do you think?
So isn't it a real significant challenge? It's a really interesting challenge to have. Here we have people who have got fantastic skill sets, unique skill sets, and they're very much in demand. And it's how do we build the followership? How do we build enough people coming through? So I suppose from my point of view, in my new position, is making sure we've got qualifications that enable people to demonstrate their capabilities and skills. That's really important, and enable people to see a career in pathology IT as being a viable one. I think that's the first thing. Of course, that takes time, and I think that will come over time. I think the other thing is thinking about how we matrix work. So again, if I go back to my time in Viapath and some of the initial design work we did around replacing IT systems there, were not driven by purely scientific, biomedical scientific staff. They were driven by people who have got an understanding in logistics. We had a rocket engineer and a former employee of NASA working on that problem. And it's taking the realization that a lot of these IT systems are potentially no different in terms of complexity or deployment than they are in any other industry. It's about our comfort in allowing people who don't work in pathology to come in and do that. And it's about making sure that those who do have the clinical expertise, going back to my point earlier on about the clinical experts, are meshed into that design as far as possible. So I suppose what I'm saying is that we probably will need to look outside of the healthcare industry to deliver some of this work. But we need to do it in such a way as that they're supported, and the governance around deployments is done by those people who understand the clinical input. And I suspect there's something here around the various accreditation bodies and certification bodies, or even the professional bodies, including my own, that might say, well, actually, how do we set some of those standards to make sure that when we're working in these ways, it's a very modern way of working, that these things still pass muster and are fit for purpose. And that goes back to that really important governance piece, and it's an area which is very, very close to my heart around quality management, is to make sure before you press the go button on any system, that you know it is safe for patients, and that's going to be the key part of it. So it's going to be a challenge. You can't replace the sort of work or replace the sort of infrastructure you've got and new technologies without bringing new people in.
And I guess it's got to be a mix of people with that biomedical science background wanting to move into a more technical IT role and supporting them, so that maybe if that's where they want their career to go, that the support and it's there, that opportunity is there for them. But also people with the strong IT background who don't necessarily have that biomedical science background can also have those opportunities, because it's all that's for me has been a real challenge for me, finding those technical skills but that bench experience. That's a real challenge.
Yeah.
And I think there needs to be maybe, I guess, a bit more of an open mind on that. Do you think?
I think so. Like I said, I'm certainly a convert to having people who are experts in their field coming and support other experts in their field. And I cast my mind back to when I was working at Reliance, like I said. And from the government's point of view, it was my job as the operations director to make sure that the products that were being proposed for delivery were fit for purpose. And that meant I used to get my clinical teams involved, those who had an interest versus, and including those who want to have a career in that area. And then those who are the experts in delivering APIs, delivering mainframe systems, etc., to make sure everyone's playing to their skill set. You don't. We no longer have a situation where in the operating theatre the surgeon is both the anaesthetist as well as the surgeon. You have two separate people who do that because they both bring different skill sets, and that's the same sort of thing. We've got it in an environment that says I've got different skill sets, we both do different jobs, but together we create a successful team, and that's probably going to be a key part of it. But I'll also add one other thing, which is it is also important that people see this as part of their career. So just historically, I'll say this very, very carefully. Historically, IT can be seen as an area where people go to finish off their days, or you're interested in this, but you're not really on the bench, so let's stick you in there. Now that's not true of anyone I know, but it's always been the folklore. And I think the people have realised that the CCIOs of the future are currently working in our laboratories. At the moment, I don't believe there are any biomedical scientists or clinical scientists who are CCIOs, but our scientists handle far more data in a far more complex way than anyone else does in the healthcare system. And yet they're not occupying those roles. So I would put a call out and say, as biomedical scientists, you should be aiming for these very senior clinical information officer roles. Who is the successor to Simon Nichols, as I mentioned earlier on, the country's chief clinical information officer? Let's hope it's a scientist.
Okay, well, I think that's a nice place to end the conversation, I think. And it's been brilliant to speak to you, David. I think for me, in summary, pathology's clearly come a long way in just the last 10 or 20 years, but certainly in the last 18 months, COVID, unfortunately or fortunately, has driven even more change. And I think that's echoed across the whole of the NHS. Digital transformation seems to be really driving a lot of change, not just in pathology, but in maternity, in A&E, and across the NHS. And the more people I speak to, the more confidence I have in the fact that digital transformation and skills in technology, and certainly in the future in AI, I think, and data, that's where we're going to really see huge benefit and drive that better patient outcome, patient experience, and so that's confident, I guess, in that. Do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think so, and I certainly I completely agree with you. Pathology, since when I was working at Engineering and Improvement, we made more progress within pathology than we have done in those 3 years than we have done in 20 years. I think also the directorate I was working, which is the Improvement Directorate, we saw outpatients within the period of time of the pandemic go from they wish to do to being done within a matter of months. And so the confidence we now have in our IT capabilities, the confidence and learning that we've had is massive. I mean, people have done some fantastic things in the last 18 months. So we just need to make sure that that doesn't fall backwards, that progress isn't lost, that the next step, like I said, this all works very well for COVID in the COVID environment. Let's make sure it works for everything else as well. But
Yeah.
we've proved it's possible, and we proved that the NHS, the history of the NHS spine, which was one of horror and all sorts, we've delivered what the spine wanted to do, and done it in a different way, in a very agile way, and probably in a way that makes far more sense to clinicians on the ground.
And that's, I guess it's having to be forced to take that leap of faith in what is potentially possible. That it feels like everybody I speak to, whether they be in a clinical position or an IT tech position, it feels like COVID has forced that leap of faith. So that if we're going to take any positives out of this, I think that's a big thing. So listen, David, I really appreciate again you taking the time to speak to me today. Anything else that you'd like to add? Where do you see yourself now with the Institute of Biomedical Science, and what's your remit, at least for the next 12 to 18 months? Let's finish on that.
Yeah, so I think my main remit really is to maintain the profile of the profession over the next period of time as we recover from COVID, to make sure that both the government and hospitals and the system don't forget the importance of our scientists. It's to push more advanced practice. We've covered around the requirement for new skills and education programs. That's something I see as really important for the institute. And I think it's making sure that the people working at the heart of healthcare are really spoken up for and are seen and more visible to the system, so people understand the value they bring. I think that's really my next top priority, if you like, and I hope that I will continue to make sure that visibility is maintained and raised. So I'll say thank you for inviting me to speak, because I think it's important that as far as possible we continue to celebrate the great work that not only our scientists have done, and our clinicians as well, but also what they have done, what they're about to do, and what they're going to be able to do. It's a really important part of our recovery in the next steps. Thank you.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more there, David. I think you're doing a fantastic job. I think that certainly the NHS has done an amazing job over the last 18 months, and they will continue to do so. And it's quite humbling to be working with the NHS at the moment. People say we just put bums on seats, but our job is challenging, trying to bring people together to deliver digital transformation, especially in pathology, and I hope we continue to do that as well. Thank you again, David, for your time. We will obviously stay in touch, and we hope to speak to you again soon. Thank you.
All this. Thanks, Dan. Thank you very much.